It was a cold, gray morning when I walked into the lawyer's office, my emotions a tangled mess of grief and trepidation. The loss of my mother still felt surreal. Just a week ago, I had stood by her hospital bed, holding her hand as she took her final breaths. Her face, pale and lined with exhaustion, had seemed so small in the sterile glow of the hospital lights. I couldn't process that she was gone, that the woman who had raised me, for better or worse, was no longer in this world. But what had haunted me the most in those last days wasn't her absence, it was the realization of how distant we had become. The lawyer's office was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of paper and the muffled voices of other clients behind closed doors. Greg, my stepfather, was already seated at the large oak table when I arrived. He glanced up at me briefly, his expression unreadable, then returned to scrolling through his phone. The indifference in his posture stung, though it didn't surprise me. Greg had always been like that, cold, dismissive, and calculating. Growing up, I often wondered if he even liked me, or if I was merely an inconvenient reminder of the life my mother had before him. The room slowly filled with my step-siblings, Rachel and Michael, who greeted Greg warmly. They barely acknowledged me, exchanging only cursory nods. It was no secret that Greg's children didn't see me as part of the family. I had always been the outsider, the half-stranger they tolerated out of obligation. My stomach churned as I took my seat at the far end of the table. I felt as though I didn't belong here, even though this was supposed to be about my mother, about her legacy. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Kramer, walked in briskly and settled at the head of the table. She shuffled a stack of papers, cleared her throat, and began to read. At first, her words were standard, detailing my mother's wishes to be cremated, the distribution of personal mementos, and a small donation to her favorite charity. But then the tone shifted. When Miss Kramer announced that the family home, along with the majority of my mother's savings and investments, was to be left to Greg, my heart sank. I stared at the lawyer, my mouth dry, as she continued reading. There was no mention of me, not as a beneficiary of the house, not as a recipient of anything significant. It felt as though my name had been deliberately erased from her legacy. Greg's children, however, were each granted substantial sums of money, along with sentimental items that I hadn't even known my mother possessed. A diamond necklace, a collection of antique porcelain figurines, even her beloved piano, all earmarked for Rachel and Michael. The room was silent for a moment after Miss Kramer finished reading. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me, waiting for a reaction. Greg's expression was smug, though he tried to mask it behind a thin veneer of sympathy. Rachel and Michael exchanged glances, their faces betraying a mix of satisfaction and awkwardness. It was clear they had expected this outcome, or worse, they had orchestrated it. I don't understand, I said finally, my voice trembling. She didn't leave me anything. Not even a keepsake. Miss Kramer hesitated, looking at me with something resembling pity. Your mother did not specify anything for you in the will, she said carefully. The majority of her estate was left to your stepfather. I felt the sting of those words like a slap. My mother had always been complicated, but this felt like a deliberate act of rejection. I thought of all the sacrifices I had made for her, moving back home to help when she was sick, taking time off work to care for her during chemo treatments, handling the household chores when Greg and his kids were nowhere to be found. And now, in the end, it was as though I didn't exist. Greg broke the silence with a sigh. Look, this isn't easy for any of us, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Your mother wanted to make sure the family was taken care of. She probably assumed you'd be fine on your own. His words stung, but they also ignited something inside me, anger. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Greg had always been a master manipulator, and now, in death, it seemed my mother had fallen under his influence one final time. I forced myself to remain calm. She didn't even leave me the house I grew up in, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Greg shrugged. The house is expensive to maintain. It made more sense for me to keep it. The audacity of his response took my breath away. This wasn't just about money or property, it was about erasing me from the narrative of my mother's life. I thought of the countless memories tied to that house, the Christmas mornings, the late-night talks in the kitchen, the garden my mother and I had planted together. All of it was being handed over to a man who had never treated me like family. I left the office in a daze, barely registering the sympathetic looks from Miss Kramer or the smug smiles from Greg and his children. The chilly wind outside did little to clear my head as I walked to my car, my thoughts racing. How could she do this to me? What had I done to deserve being shut out like this? Over the next few days, the anger and hurt festered. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in the lawyer's office, the way Greg had smirked as though he had won some unspoken battle. I felt like a fool for ever believing my mother would have fought for me. As I packed up the few belongings I had left at her house, I came across a box of old letters tucked away in her closet. They were tied together with a faded ribbon, the handwriting on the envelopes unfamiliar. My curiosity piqued. I opened the first letter and began to read. What I discovered would change everything. I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the chaos of half-packed boxes and discarded memories. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of dust and old fabric. The letters I had found in my mother's closet were spread out before me like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. The handwriting on the envelopes was unfamiliar, delicate yet deliberate, as if the author had taken great care with each stroke of the pen. The first letter had been dated over 30 years ago, long before Greg came into the picture. My mother's name was scrawled across the front in a bold, looping script. Beneath it, the return address read William Carter. I didn't recognize the name. Curiosity gnawed at me as I untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the first piece of aged, yellowing paper. "Dearest Linda," it began. The words leapt off the page, intimate and raw, weaving a story I had never known. William's tone was affectionate, almost poetic, as he described his love for my mother. He wrote about their plans for a future together, their dreams of building a life away from the suffocating expectations of their families. But as I read on, the letters took a darker turn. "I know you're scared," one letter read, "but I promise we can figure this out. Don't let fear dictate your choices. We'll face it together." Another letter, dated just a few weeks later, was more desperate. "Why won't you answer my calls? Please, Linda, don't let him control you. I know what he's threatening, but we can find a way out." I felt a chill run down my spine as I pieced together the subtext. It seemed my mother had been in a relationship with this William Carter, but something or someone had intervened. My thoughts immediately turned to Greg. Had he known my mother back then? Had he somehow forced her to end things with William? The letters didn't provide enough clarity, only hints of a painful decision my mother had been pressured to make. Driven by a mix of anger and confusion, I decided to dig deeper. If my mother had kept these letters hidden for all these years, they must have been important to her, and if Greg had played a role in their separation, it might explain why she had seemed so conflicted in the last years of her life. I spent hours combing through old photo albums, journals, and loose papers, searching for any additional clues. That's when I found a journal tucked away in the back of her nightstand, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. Inside, her handwriting was small and neat, the pages filled with thoughts and musings she had never shared aloud. One entry, dated shortly after my birth, stood out. "William deserves to know, but I'm too scared. What if Greg follows through on his threats? I can't risk it, not with a baby to think about. I've already lost so much. I can't lose you too." My breath caught in my throat. Was she saying what I thought she was saying? Could William Carter have been my biological father? And if so, what had Greg done to keep him out of the picture? I couldn't ignore the implications. If Greg had coerced my mother into cutting ties with William, it would explain why she had stayed with him despite their loveless marriage. It might even explain why she had left everything to him in her will. Perhaps she had been so consumed by guilt and fear that she felt she owed him something, even in death. But the question remained, why had Greg been so determined to erase William from her life and mine? Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet. A quick search of William Carter's name revealed dozens of results, but none that matched the timeline or location from the letters. I tried narrowing the search by adding the city where my mother had grown up, and finally, I found a promising lead: a William Carter who had owned a small bookstore in the downtown area during the 1980s. The store had since closed, but there was a note in the local archives about a community event he had hosted just a few years ago. It included a recent photo. My heart raced as I stared at the image on my screen. The man in the photo was older, his hair streaked with gray and his face lined with age, but there was a warmth in his smile that felt strangely familiar. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at a piece of my own history. I decided to reach out. The article had mentioned the name of the organization hosting the event, and with a bit more searching, I found a contact email. I spent nearly an hour drafting a message, trying to strike the right balance between curiosity and caution. "Dear Mr. Carter," I began, "I recently came across some letters you wrote to my late mother, Linda. I believe there's a chance you may have known her during the early 1990s. If this is the case, I'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. There are some family matters I'm trying to understand, and your insight could be invaluable." I hesitated before hitting send, my finger hovering over the button. What if I was wrong? What if this man had no connection to my mother, and I was chasing ghosts? But the need for answers outweighed my doubts, and I clicked send. The next few days were agonizing. I checked my email obsessively, hoping for a reply. In the meantime, I couldn't bear to face Greg or his children. I avoided their calls and ignored their messages, burying myself in the task of packing up my mother's belongings. Each item I touched felt like a fragment of her life I had never truly understood. Finally, an email arrived. The subject line read Linda. My hands shook as I opened it. "Thank you for reaching out. I did know your mother many years ago, and I would be happy to talk with you. Please let me know a time and place that works for you. Best regards, William Carter." Relief and apprehension washed over me in equal measure. This was my chance to learn the truth. But as I began to draft my response, another thought crept into my mind: what would Greg do if he found out? I pushed the fear aside and focused on the next step. I arranged to meet William at a quiet cafe in the neighboring town, far enough away to avoid running into anyone who might know Greg. As I hit send on the email confirming our meeting, I couldn't help but feel that I was standing on the edge of something life-changing. Little did I know, the answers I sought would not only reshape my understanding of my mother but also force me to confront the man who had controlled our lives for far too long. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. I had chosen this place deliberately neutral, inconspicuous, and far from Greg's prying eyes. My hands trembled as I held a steaming cup of tea, the warmth doing little to calm my nerves. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, each new revelation pulling me deeper into a web of secrets I hadn't been prepared to unravel. The door jingled, and I looked up to see a man entering. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room before his gaze landed on me. It was William Carter. He looked exactly like his photograph, though there was something about seeing him in person that hit me harder than I'd expected. His presence carried a quiet strength, and his kind, curious eyes made my chest tighten with unspoken questions. "Are you?" he began as he approached my table. "Yes," I said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for meeting me." He smiled warmly, though there was a hint of caution in his expression. "Of course. I have to admit, your message surprised me. It's been many years since I thought about your mother." We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I struggled to find the right words, afraid of what his answers might reveal. Finally, I took a deep breath and began. "I found your letters," I said, "in my mother's belongings. They were tucked away in a box, like she was trying to hide them. Reading them, I realized there's a part of her life I never knew about, a part that might explain why things turned out the way they did." William's expression softened, though his eyes darkened with the weight of old memories. "Linda and I had something special," he said quietly, "but it was complicated. Her family didn't approve of me, and there were other factors that made things difficult." I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "What happened? Why did she leave you?" He hesitated, his hands clasped tightly around his coffee cup. "I don't know how much you know about Greg," he said finally. The mention of Greg's name sent a chill down my spine. "I know enough to believe he had something to do with it," I said. "He's been a controlling force in her life for as long as I can remember. But what could he have done back then?" William exhaled deeply, as if the weight of the past was pressing down on him. "Greg was persistent," he said. He came into Linda's life at a vulnerable time, after her father passed away. He positioned himself as a protector, someone who could help her through her grief. But it didn't take long for me to see through him. He was manipulative, possessive. When Linda and I started seeing each other seriously, Greg saw me as a threat. I gripped the edge of the table, my mind racing. A threat to what? To his plans, William said bitterly. He wanted to marry her, to tie her to him in a way she couldn't escape. When he realized she didn't love him, that she was planning to leave with me, he used every weapon he had to stop her. He threatened to ruin her reputation, to spread lies about us. But the worst part. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. The worst part was what he threatened to do to me. What do you mean? I asked, my heart pounding. He said he'd destroy my business, my family. He had connections, and I believed him. I told Linda I didn't care, I'd fight for her, no matter what. But she was terrified. She didn't want me to lose everything because of her. He shook his head, his eyes glistening. So she ended it. She told me to stay away, for both our sakes. The pain in his voice was palpable, and I felt my own eyes sting with tears. And then she married him, I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. She gave up everything to keep you safe. William nodded. It broke her heart. I could see it every time I ran into her around town. But she felt she didn't have a choice, and when she found out she was pregnant. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Pregnant? He looked at me, his gaze steady. Your mother told me she was carrying my child, but Greg didn't know. I begged her to let me be part of your life, but she was too afraid of what Greg would do. She told me it was better for you to grow up thinking he was your father. Safer. The room seemed to tilt around me as the weight of his words sank in. My entire life had been built on a lie, a carefully constructed facade designed to protect me from a man who had manipulated and controlled my mother. I don't know what to say, I whispered. I always felt like something was off, like I didn't really belong in that family. And now I know why. William reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on mine. I'm sorry, he said. I've thought about you every day, wondering what kind of life you had. I wanted to be there for you, but I didn't know how. A surge of anger rose within me, not at William, but at Greg. He had stolen so much from both of us, weaving a web of lies and fear that had dictated my mother's every move. I need to confront him, I said, my voice firm. He can't keep getting away with this. William hesitated. Be careful, he warned. Greg is a dangerous man. He knows how to twist the truth to his advantage. If you're going to stand up to him, make sure you have proof. His words echoed in my mind as I left the cafe, a storm of emotions swirling inside me. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer, but I also knew that taking on Greg would be a battle unlike any I'd faced before. That evening, I returned to my mother's house with a renewed sense of purpose. I scoured every corner of the house for anything that might corroborate William's story: old photographs, letters, legal documents. And then, tucked away in the attic, I found a file labeled personal. Inside were copies of letters from Greg to my mother, some filled with veiled threats, others dripping with false affection. There were also medical records confirming my mother's pregnancy dates, aligning perfectly with the timeline of her relationship with William. It was the proof I needed. As I sat on the attic floor, surrounded by the remnants of my mother's hidden life, I felt a surge of determination. Greg had controlled us for far too long, but now I had the truth on my side. It was time to confront him, to force him to face the consequences of his actions. But even as I steeled myself for the confrontation, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle ahead would come at a cost. The drive to Greg's house felt longer than it was, the road ahead blurring through the lens of my adrenaline-fueled focus. The weight of the evidence I'd uncovered sat heavy in my bag on the passenger seat, but heavier still was the anger simmering beneath my skin. For so long, Greg had operated unchecked, bending my mother's life and by extension my own to his will. But now, armed with the truth, I was determined to end his stranglehold on the past. When I arrived, the house loomed before me, familiar yet suddenly foreign. The meticulously trimmed hedges and pristine driveway, once symbols of stability, now felt like a facade for something far darker. I parked and sat for a moment, forcing myself to breathe. This wasn't just about confronting Greg, it was about reclaiming the life he had stolen from my mother, from William, and from me. Inside, Greg was in his usual spot, the armchair by the window, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "I wasn't expecting you," he said, setting the glass down. "I thought you'd be busy sorting through your mother's things." I stood in the doorway, the bag slung over my shoulder. "I found something while I was sorting," I said evenly. "Something you might want to explain." He raised an eyebrow, his usual air of smugness firmly in place. "Is that so? What could possibly be so urgent?" I walked over and dropped the bag on the coffee table between us. Letters. Journal entries. Medical records. Enough to tell me the truth about what happened between you, Mom, and William Carter. At the mention of William's name, Greg's composure faltered for just a moment, a flicker of recognition, quickly masked by a smirk. "Ah, William," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I was wondering when that name might resurface." I clenched my fists, my voice trembling with anger. "You manipulated her. You threatened her, forced her to leave the man she loved. And for what? So you could trap her in a marriage she never wanted?" Greg sighed, his tone condescending. "You're overreacting. Your mother made her choices. She wasn't some helpless victim. She wasn't helpless because you didn't give her a choice." I shot back, my voice rising. "You made sure of that, didn't you? You made her believe she had no way out." His expression hardened, the smugness giving way to something colder. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I did what I had to do to protect her, to protect you. William Carter was nothing but a dreamer, someone who would have dragged her down. She needed someone strong, someone who could give her a real future." I stared at him in disbelief. "You don't get to rewrite history to make yourself the hero. You didn't protect her, you controlled her. You took away her happiness and called it love." Greg stood abruptly, his face darkening. "You think you know everything because you found a few letters? Let me tell you something, life isn't some fairy tale. Your mother understood that, even if you don't." I reached into the bag and pulled out one of the letters, holding it up for him to see. "Does this look like someone who understood or someone who was terrified? She was afraid of you, Greg, and she stayed with you because she thought it was the only way to keep us safe." For a moment he said nothing, his jaw clenched tight. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders sagged. "She didn't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I gave her everything, and it was never enough." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, but it wasn't enough to extinguish my anger. "You didn't give her what she needed," I said quietly. "You gave her control disguised as love, and in the process you took away her choices. But I'm done letting you control me, and I'm done letting you control her legacy." I reached into the bag again, pulling out the medical records. "This proves that William was my biological father, not you. I'm not bound to you or your lies anymore." Greg's face twisted with a mix of anger and desperation. "You think anyone's going to care about some old medical records? I raised you. I was the one who was there for you." "You were there for you," I countered. "And now, everyone's going to know the truth. I've already spoken to William. He deserves to know his daughter, and I deserve to know him." The silence that followed was deafening. Greg's facade had finally cracked, and for the first time he looked small, defeated. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said firmly. "The mistake was letting you control us for so long. That ends now." I turned and walked out, my heart pounding with a mix of triumph and fear. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and for the first time in years I felt free. The weeks that followed were a blur of difficult yet liberating conversations. William and I met several more times, each meeting bringing us closer to a relationship that felt long overdue. He told me stories about my mother, painting a picture of the woman she had been before Greg had entered her life. It was bittersweet to imagine the version of her I'd never known, but it also gave me a sense of peace, knowing that she had been capable of such love. Greg, meanwhile, retreated into himself. I heard from his children that he had become more withdrawn, his once dominant presence now a shadow of what it had been. I didn't pity him, but I also didn't feel the need to punish him further. Exposing the truth had been enough. The final step came when I met with a lawyer to formally amend my mother's will. With William's support, I established a fund in her name, dedicated to helping women escape controlling and abusive relationships. It felt like the right way to honor her memory, a way to give others the choices she had been denied. As I stood in the lawyer's office, signing the final documents, I felt a sense of closure. My mother's story had been one of heartbreak and resilience, but it wasn't over. Through me, through William, and through the fund, her legacy would live on. Driving home, I thought about the road ahead. There would be challenges, no doubt, but for the first time I felt like I was facing them on my own terms. I wasn't just my mother's daughter or Greg's stepchild. I was my own person, free to define my life in a way they never could, and that was a freedom worth fighting for.